IMB, the Malaysian bank, to being one of ASEAN's most important banks, now heading Malaysia's development banks for Malaysia's developmental future. But today, it's the part of Nazir that's been thinking about workshopping what it is that future positive democracy might look like in Malaysia. So Nazir, I'm going to turn to you first to tell us a little bit about what's the problem that democracy faces and what does that look like in Malaysia? What's the problem, as it were, that we're all trying to solve here? Nazir Razak.
Thank you. Thank you, Ngairi, and good evening, everyone from KL. Let me first of all just mention that today is the Chinese New Year as well. So to those who celebrate, let me wish you a Happy New Year. Now, the background to my interest in this topic is that back in 2015, I first advocated the idea of a national reset. And I argued then that this should begin with the establishment of a deliberative council or platform, quite similar to the deliberative platform that was set up in 1970 in Malaysia that we call the National Consultative Council. And that had 67 people and was set up after the race riots and the declaration of emergency rule. Two things have happened since 2015. One is that the situation in Malaysia has continued to deteriorate. We had the 1MDB debacle that I think epitomized the depth of corruption in the system. Two is the economy continues to be subpar. Three is, I think, there continues to be a hardening of identity politics. Four, various attempts at reforms in the system have met with fierce resistance from vested interests. So the system, which was designed in 1970, as I said, continues to be in place, and I argue is now dysfunctional. And this dysfunctionality has gotten worse since 2018, when the dominant party government of Barisan Nasional fell for the first time in 61 years. And since then, we've had three unstable coalitions governing the country. So the other thing that's happened since 2015 is, of course, the growing popularity of deliberative platforms across the world. So it kind of synced with what I was advocating for Malaysia. As you're saying, Ngairi, there's been this growing frustration with representative democracy. I think clearly many of the current top of mind frustrations with inequality and inability to deal with climate change and so on have been blamed on the shortcomings of the democratic systems. And when I think about it, democracy is actually quite poor at dealing with long-term structural issues, principally because of the heavy reliance on political parties and politicians with naturally short-term views. And I think clearly the data also shows that deliberative platforms have been very effective. I think since 1979, there have been something like 574 deliberative platforms across the world. And the data I looked at said that 76% of those had more than 50% of their recommendations actually implemented, and that's a pretty good score. And clearly, it's enhances democracy because it kind of is more inclusive in terms of people involved in policy making and national issues. And it's also compelling because deliberative democracy arrives at solutions or recommendations after deliberations, which generally feature reflections, compromise, collaboration between participants instead of partisanship and electioneering, which you tend to get in parliament. So decisions are based on reason, not political or economic might. Now, the Citizen Assembly that we talk about here and the National Consultative Council 1970 are actually both deliberative platforms, but quite different in terms of membership, establishment processes, and implementation capabilities. I mean, when you have a deliberative platform within a dictatorship, it's much easier to have things implemented. So to me, that old NCC model is no longer suitable for my country in today's conditions. I think we need to look at the citizens' assemblies that have proliferated across the world. And my last point is that in October this year, I wrote to His Majesty the King of Malaysia together with 54 other people to suggest the establishment of a citizens' assembly. I called it the Better Malaysia Assembly, to deliberate the fundamental issues towards reform and the building of a better Malaysia. And of course, it'll be fascinating for me and for many of the listeners, I believe, to hear more about, from Hélène in particular, in terms of the experiences of other countries in democracy and, of course, her other analysis around the various issues at establishing these platforms.
Well, thank you, Nazir. So the first part of your comments were really describing, as I said at the outset, some of the malaise besetting all democracies in the world, Hélène. Democracies that are corrupted by special interests, that are divisive because politicians are using identity politics, and that are short-termist by nature because it's running from one election to another. How do we solve that?
How do we solve that? Well, first of all, happy Chinese New Year, everyone. I tend to think that in order to solve that, you really need to have a precise understanding of the problem. And my diagnosis of the problem is that we can blame money in politics, we can blame globalization, we can blame technological change. All of these factors have played a role. But for me, a key problem is in the design of representative democracy as we reinvented it in the 18th century. And the design flaw that I see is that the way we select our democratic representatives, and in particular people who make the laws for us on our behalf, in our name, is too oligarchic. We choose them through the mechanism of periodic elections. It's widely seen as like a feature of the democracy. But in fact, ancient Greeks thought it was an oligarchic selection mechanism. And in theory and in practice, it's bound to select, a relatively homogeneous group of socio-political elites. And it's not all bad. That's done some good over the last 200 years, but I think we're reaching the limits of that system because we are not including enough voices in the way we make policies, make laws, and we leave out too many people, and we're paying the price. That's why you get the yellow vests in France, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, demonstrations in Chile that led to constitutional change, revolution in Iceland that almost led to a constitutional change. I mean, it's everywhere. People are fed up. This system is not delivering. And not just because of external reasons, because of internal problems that I think we have yet to confront people. And a solution then, if we agree on that diagnostic, is to consider alternative selection mechanisms like random selection. And when Nazir mentioned these platforms and these citizens' assemblies, it's crucial to say that the ones I have in mind at least are based on random selection, not self-selection, not election, not appointment, because only through random selection do you truly tap the full diversity of profiles, ethnicities, experiences, life experiences of a given population. So I think for me it's not the solution, but it's definitely part of the solution, of the many solutions we need to bring to the table.
So tell us how the random selection works. A lot of people would say, sorry. Oh, your microphone. Can you put it on the lapel of your jacket? Sorry, folks.
Higher?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
On this jacket.
I'm so sorry.
There we go. So,
is it better now? No, still not. Okay. Well, it's supposed to be on, so I'm not sure.
Can we fix the microphone, Hélène's microphone? Thank you. So a lot of people would say, oh, really, you're going to go and grab every fourth person on the street and invite them to make laws for the country? Some of us might then think, oh, actually, if I look at the politicians we've got, that might be better. But how would that work? How, when you say random selection, explain what random selection would mean.
So the Greeks had a very, functional system where they had a so-called kleroterion, a machine where you put your token in it, and then it, somehow decided whether you got a stone that indicated you were going to be part of the popular jury or not.
Sorry, Hélène, we're going to hear more about how the Greeks actually did this. Well, we think about how.
Can you hear me now? I'm so sorry. Okay, great. So the microphone was the problem, not me. Thank you very much. Okay, so the Greeks had a system where they were able to allocate positions of power of political offices randomly. Everybody put a little token in a machine called the kleroterion, and then they knew whether they were assigned or not that day to a particular popular jury. It's a council of 500, which set the agenda for the city of Athens. I mean, it worked. Now we have other methods. They are based on advanced statistical techniques. So in the context of the French Citizens Convention for Climate, for example, which convened a sample of 150 people, what they did is that they generated random phone numbers, around 300,000 of them, and then they called those people, and then they constituted demographic groups, age, gender, socioeconomic categories, etc., education level, geographic origins, and then they sort of made a sample of 150 people that tracked all the relevant dimensions of the larger French public, so that you in the end had a sort of mini portrait of France in that sample. The larger your sample, the better. You track more dimensions. I think it's ideal if you have a sample of over 300, 400, 500. But even with 150, you can get a decent sort of a representation of the various faces of French people.
Just tell us
any people.
And tell us about the difference between getting a randomly selected group of people to deliberate and decide about an issue and ruling by referendum, for example, where you're consulting all the people.
Right. Well, so there's a trade-off, right? With the referenda, you get a lot more participation, but you don't get the deliberation. So I think where Nazir and I agree is that you need reasons and thoughtful exchange of views and information to produce legitimacy. If you only aggregate top of the head sort of opinions, it doesn't necessarily lead to a terribly legitimate or even good outcome. So the key in a functional democracy is to combine those two methods. I don't see them as alternatives. It's not like, referenda are all bad and only deliberative citizens' assemblies are good. But I think if we're going to produce laws and policies, it's not going to be through the mechanism of a referendum, right? The referendum comes at the end of the process to validate it, or perhaps to repeal it. It could be a sort of recall system where the people, decide that a law is not working for them, and then they vote en masse to sort of like repeal it. But so I think it's neither. You don't have to choose between aggregation and deliberation. You just have to find a way to articulate those two things, because they're both essential to democracy.
I really like the way in your work you draw our attention to how the jury system works in common law systems. Because there we've got a randomly selected group of people who deliberate. And I think your point is that if they know that their decisions are going to really have effect, they do it very seriously. Is that right? How important is it that they know that their decisions are going to be the ones that decide whether you go to prison or not?
I think long-term it really matters. So far, the many cases of deliberative assemblies that have been tried have not had decisive power. Very few have, but they've had influence on the process, and that has been enough to really motivate the citizens. But when they're not taken seriously, you risk a backlash, right? In the French case, for example, at one point they felt like they had proposed these, radical and informed proposals to curb climate change in France in a spirit of social justice, and then the government proceeded to dilute a lot of the recommendations, and that generates anger and frustrations because you feel like what you did was participate in a it's called participation washing experiment, where you pretend to consult people and take them seriously, but you just do that to basically buy social peace. So it's really important that at some point we institutionalize those bodies and treat them as political actors in their own right. So in my sort of work, I tend to imagine a radical version of an open democracy where we replace elected officials with randomly selected bodies. But of course, more realistically, what we could do is hybridize and figure out a space where randomly selected bodies would be able to play a role in complement to existing elected chambers rather than in replacement of them.
Last question. I'm going to come back to Nazir to find out what this would look like. Would this be possible even in Malaysia? And then come to the audience for your questions and suggestions and reflections. But just last point on the deliberation. We're living in a social media age where people do, you could say, deliberate with each other. But what we see is a kind of venting of anger and rage and aggression and, on Twitter, on Instagram, wherever it is. So what are the necessary parts of a deliberative process? And do they calm people down? Like, once they're in that process, does it become less a venting of their identity politics and more a deliberation about the issue in front of them?
Yes, what we observe in these processes is that it tends to depolarize people and bring them together in really surprisingly effective ways. I think it comes from the fact that when they're chosen, it's not on the basis of their partisan affiliation, on the basis of how rich or poor they are. It's really on the basis of they're a citizen and they're an equal member of a society, and on that basis alone, they get a chance to participate. So when they come in, they are not wedded to a particular position. They are open-minded, at least at the beginning of the process. And I think it diffuses a lot of the anger. Whereas in parliaments, people come in as party representatives. They're already wedded to views. They're already, grandstanding, posturing. It's harder to change your mind. People in social media and on the internet tend to sort themselves out on the basis of what they think and who they agree with. So it reinforces the sense of polarization. In these randomly selected assemblies, you create this sort of magic where, a baker will talk to a banker and a cleaning lady will talk to, a retired pilot. And you get this conversation that never happened in real life,
And it's not just theory, is it? Tell us about where you've seen this actually work, actually be tried and work.
Well, at that point, it's worked in a number of countries. The OECD documents over 600 cases of such, deliberative assemblies around the world. They range from, small groups of 15 to much larger groups of a few hundreds. But so they've been done. We don't know enough about what worked and what didn't, to be honest, but many of them led to actual policy changes, have influenced legislation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The more famous cases are in Ireland. Ireland, very famously at this point, managed to decriminalize abortion by using a randomly selected citizens' assembly of 99 Irish people who came together for several weekends, concluded that they needed to decriminalize abortion, and that proposal then went to Parliament, and Parliament put it to a referendum, and then 2/3 of the population said, yes, it's time to decriminalize abortion. It worked also on other issues that are, morally fraught. It was marriage equality for gay people. In France, it worked on a very, very different topic, which was climate change. So it seemed a lot more technical and complicated. The idea was, how do we curb greenhouse gas emissions in France by 40% of the 1990s levels in ways that do not basically trigger another yellow vest movements? Because what had happened in France is that Macron tried to be ecological in some ways, created a carbon tax, and then it triggered like massive rebellion among the yellow vests. So that's a very different topic, but it worked as well. It led to the most ambitious climate law, environmental law that we've ever had in France. So it's worked.
So Nazir, does this inspire you to have a go at this in Malaysia, or what would stand in the way? Tell us about how that looks from where you're sitting in Malaysia?
Well, I mean, I'd like to, hear about how this idea is, sold, if you like, in other countries. And from what I can gather, typically these things, the kind of major ones like Chile, etc., come about after you have a major incident. Unfortunately, in Malaysia, I guess that we don't have one. So it's a little bit more of a challenge to kind of convert, particularly the parliamentarians, to this idea, because some of them are already telling me, say, look, this is our job. Why are you trying to take away our jobs? So it requires some convincing. But back to the discussion on composition, Hélène, if I recall correctly, the Irish 2012 actually had 2/3 randomly selected and 1/3 parliamentarians, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So, you can get this mix, and I don't know what drives the mix. Is it the complexities of the issues and so on? Two is, I wonder if in the Malaysian situation, a bit more of a balance would be more suitable, given what we're looking at here is a complete national reset and many, many complicated policy issues within that may require, more, I guess, people with more experience and intellect to grasp some of these issues. So I was thinking of something of a balance between, kind of random selection, as well as some people who are selected by virtue of their leadership roles or their intellectual standing.
Right. So these are excellent questions. I'd say that from the evidence that we have, there are several models, and the one that seems to have worked the best is indeed the hybrid one. Ireland, the way it worked is that they didn't wait for I think a massive rebellion. I don't remember that being a sort of precedent to the decision to resort to citizens' assemblies, but they did get a lot of activism from academics who believed in those ideas, pushed for them, and activists who just were on board for a while and sort of organized a tour of Ireland and talked to local politicians, raised funds to get them tried here and there. And eventually they convinced Parliament to do this hybrid first citizens' assembly that was 2/3 randomly selected citizens, 1/3 politicians. And it worked so well, it created so much goodwill and trust between these different constituencies that Parliament then, when this issue of abortion came on the national stage, felt comfortable and trusting a fully random sample with the recommendation. And don't forget that at no point did Parliament lose control of the process, because in the end, they were the ones who were going to decide what to do with the recommendation. So it's not like at any point in time, the randomly selected sample is truly empowered to make the decision, but they're given a real influence, a real voice. The French system, it happened because it's more like the Chilean example. It took a social movement that was so scary that it was very scary. November 2018, the government was scared to death. So they played two cards. One was repression. The other was deliberation. They started so-called great national debate that took 2 months and basically put French politics on pause. And they started experimenting with multiple ways of consulting the people. You had an online platform, you had randomly selected assemblies at the regional level, 20 of them, roughly 21 even, including in our ultramarine territories. You had open meetings that people could organize themselves. I mean, it was really just let's see what sticks. And what stuck was really the idea of a national level randomly selected assembly on environmental issues. That's how it worked. But at the end of the day, critics will tell you, well, did it really work? Because in the end, again, everything was filtered through the parliamentary system and the ministries and the presidential will. So it's not as ambitious. The result is not as ambitious as what the citizens had proposed. So, in the end, it's always hybrid. It's always hybrid. I think it's more pacific and more successful in the Irish case, because from the beginning, there was a collaboration between politicians and randomly selected citizens. That said, I have to nuance that by saying that the CESE, our third legislative assembly in France, is trying to get representatives of civil society to work with randomly selected citizens. They've done 3 experiments so far, and it's not working very well. It's really hard to combine the logic of election or appointment and the logic of random selection. It doesn't always gel. It gelled in the case of the Irish First Assembly, but what I've seen so far is that in other types of mixes, it doesn't work.
And lots of the questions online, and thank you, those of you online, for sending in such great questions. And lots of the questions are about this exact question of representativeness. Bassa Oncornet asks, you know, in an era where intersectionality means that almost every combination of identity traits produces its own unique outcome, how on earth do we get representation in this sample? Daniel Scharf asks, is there a minimum age? Does it depend on the subject matter? How does it go? Others, Marietta asks, what about the economically vulnerable, etc. What's interesting about the first 2 questions about representation is they're assuming that the random selection has to in some way be representative, but that's not true in a jury.
Yeah, it's not true in a jury because it's too small, for sure. But I mean, so, you know, I like the Greek model best in a way because it's completely blind. It was really one person, one token. It's not like, oh, we're gonna do a stratified random sampling using categories like, I don't know, well, economic status or education level, or because that already is a form of essentialization of people that I don't love. I think it's kind of unavoidable given the constraints, given the world we live in. But ideally, you don't have to define ahead of time who you want in your sample, because we can't deal with 2 large samples, and we have to do this stratified random sampling anyway. So then the question becomes, well, what criteria do you choose? And sometimes the nature of the question matters. So I think gender will always be an essential criterion, for example. Age too, probably, education level probably, but ethnicity and race, for example, it's not possible in the French context because it's illegal. Religion is illegal too. It's not something you can ask people to divulge. So you cannot, you know, make quotas for those people. In other contexts, maybe it's legitimate to have those categories. In the French context, one criterion that could have been used was your views on climate change, to make sure we have the same number of climato-skeptic people in the sample as you have in the larger population. They didn't go for it though, and as a result, and I think that's a design flaw, the sample was overly in favor of, you know, dealing with climate change, was really convinced that climate change was happening. So it was not quite representative of the French population at large. I mean, you know, this was one of the discrepancies.
Is there a question from the room? Yes, do introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Federico and I'm from El Salvador, where our democracy is not resetting, it is disrupting. We have a millennial Twitter president who's 38 years old that has over 92% of approval rating. And with his super majority in Congress, he has found loopholes in our constitution to appoint a completely new Supreme Court, a new constitutional court, who recently issued a decree that re-election, albeit prohibited by constitutional standards, it is a human right, is the claim, to seek re-election. And once again, with a backing of 92% of popularity, you know, like, what is left in the toolbox of the minimum opposition that stands, that wants to ensure that the institutionality of the country continues and that there are fair rules of the game for more participants in safeguarding democracy, even though the president claims that this is a new model of governance and it is backed by the will and the percentage of the people.
But thank you. And actually, I think where you're getting to with the question is something that David Farnsworth asked, which is how do we get from there to here, right? How do we transition? The story Federico tells us of El Salvador repeats in so many countries. where term limits and institutions are being eroded. So any thoughts? I'd be interested to hear from both Nazir and Hélène on this question of where do you begin to reset?
Not like that, I guess. I don't think Salvador is a good example. It's again this belief that savior is going to come along and reset democracy for us without really including us in the choices then that are made later on. So I don't believe in that model. It's a really difficult question, the question from here to there. I think you need a combination of social movements pushing for changes, well-intentioned visionary leaders at the top from within the existing system, willing to put their own political career at risk by saying, look, it's true, we're not doing a good job as a group because we're selected in ways that are too oligarchic. And if you look at the American Congress, it's the embodiment of that sort of elitism. So let's change the system. And maybe we don't have to do it overnight, but we can start by creating a House of the People that is randomly selected. And we sort of devolve some of the power of Congress to that new chamber. For example, there's a debate in the US about whether Congress people should be allowed to trade stocks, because they consistently do 12% better than the stock market. There's a huge issue there. Somehow they have to self-regulate and make the decisions about their own salaries and the things they're allowed to do. And that's a problem. You could delegate that task of legislating about that to a popular jury of sort, a House of the People. Mm-hmm. That would be a lot more non-biased and disinterested, I think, than the current system. So, and then you can figure out where there's a division of labor that can occur that ultimately reinforces the overall system, even as it potentially disempowers elected officials to an extent. Because I don't believe that you can just graft on the system another chamber while keeping things as they are. There will have to be trade-offs and devolution of power.
And Max Emmett asks, how do we strengthen the incentives for politicians to accept this? Nazir, you're nodding. What do you think? I mean,
this is precisely where I am, because at the moment, this is an idea that we have put forward, but it's just the kind of thinking behind this concept, and we hope that it appeals to the institutions, be it the rulers, the monarchy, be it parliament, be it the politicians. But and we're giving that time, but then we're asking ourselves the question: do you really think they're going to come around, or do we have to convert ourselves into a social movement and kind of garner support from other NGOs, etc.? And then we ask ourselves the question: what do politicians and institutions really listen to? Well, they listen to numbers. So should we go out and do our own referendum of the Malaysians and sort of say, okay, how many of you agree that the system is dysfunctional and we need deliberative democracy? And then if you can get serious numbers behind the idea, then the politicians may not have a choice but support you. The other alternative is to really sell this idea to some political parties who would hopefully then build it into their manifestos going into an election. So if they win the election, they're somewhat committed to setting up these deliberative platforms. So that's actually very interesting, because that's exactly the thought process that we're going through at the moment.
So let's take more ideas from the room. Yes.
Do introduce yourselves. Hi, I'm Melissa Lockett. I'm from the US. I'm doing a master's in public policy here. So I'm curious, a lot of the conversations we're talking about are the strength of institutions and maybe, the elite and power capture. But a lot of the changes, like in the US, for example, require those elites to actually codify or enact them. And so how do you realistically think that we reset democracy if we're looking for the elites to do that themselves? I don't see how you do that without some major power shift, or frankly, I don't see how you do it in a peaceful manner. I would love to be told otherwise. I'm just curious.
So, Hélène, you said before, visionary leaders and a strong civil society. Is there another bit that?
Well, again, the case of France is interesting because I never thought I would see it there, given, you know, we have a Fifth Republic, which is extremely, I mean, the spirit is quite monarchist, you know, like we have it's based around that super powerful president, the parliament doesn't have many powers, but somehow, and it did take, you know, someone willing to try it. So President Macron deserves some credit for, you know, trying these new forms of deliberative and participatory democracy. But that said, it would have never happened without the pressure of social movements. So I'm not saying violence is the answer, absolutely not, but some amount of pressure, you know, demonstrations, strikes, giving the power that be a sense that things are not right and people are fed up and that some things need to change. I think that worked in that particular case, but it needs to be accompanied by solutions. That's the other thing, because the Yellow Vest movements were all against, but not for many things. And then over time, an alliance developed with academics, with activists who had ideas, and they came up with this platform of first a citizen-initiated referendum. That's actually what the Yellow Vests wanted more than anything, more than the Citizens' Assembly, and an agenda of citizens' assemblies pushed by various activists. We had an artist named Cyril Dion, who's a documentary maker. So civil society, you know, people from all walks of life, but artists, people with followers on Twitter, spreading awareness, and it works. That's another venue for change, I think. And it goes faster than you'd think.
Nazir mentioned a referendum. Isn't that problematic? Isn't a referendum rather like Twitter? I mean, it elicits a gut instinct reaction from people, which is the opposite to the kind of get people deliberating and taking responsibility for their decisions. So, what's your response to Nazir? Should he have a referendum on this?
Again, it depends who is initiating it, who's, you know, putting the question to the public. So if it's governments, it's worrisome to some degree because they're gonna, you know, frame it in such a way that it plays in their favor. That, at least in France, that's always how things have been playing out. So we're very wary of referenda. But in Switzerland, that's a completely alternative model where referenda are conducted, like, you know, all the time on a monthly basis. And people are really used to them. And you can trigger them through so-called citizens' initiative. So if a large enough number of signatories have an idea and they want it to be, you know, put to the larger public, then that's how it works. To me, that more horizontal use of the referendum, also in a culture and a country that's already very deliberative, is actually quite good. The question is, it's not easy to import the practices of Switzerland to, you know, countries like France or perhaps Malaysia, where it's not the culture. We don't have a culture of referendum that's truly democratic. So I'm also not sure.
Difficult. Other comments, questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm from Afghanistan and currently studying public policy at Blavatnik School of Government. So my question is, as you may know, that a couple of months ago, the government of Afghanistan was overthrown by Taliban. So, and how you define, so we chose someone who was representing us, but then our leaders failed. And now the country is in a catastrophe. So how you define resetting democracy in the states and such fragile states where people are fighting for their rights? For example, Afghanistan, for example, Myanmar, where the regime was overthrown by the military coup. And now people are fighting, but still it depends. The context of each country depends on culture, tradition, or on the territory, the neighboring countries. So do you have a specific form of resetting a democracy, especially in developing or the fragile states, whether how it may work? Because Afghanistan has experienced a lot of regimes and a lot of invasions. Russia, Britain, like US, all of them failed.
And can I just add in, Dr. Oseretin Okunbo asks, you know, he mentions the recent coup d'etat in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Chad, in Guinea, and the fragility of democracies in that part of Africa. In what ways can the risk of a coup be averted? So in these settings in which democracy is being tested at its extreme and government itself is fragile, does your do your ideas about democracy have any relevance, do you think?
It's really hard. That's definitely, my examples are all taken from, Western countries that are stable, have like functioning bureaucracies, highly educated populations. That said, I think in order to prepare for a true democratic change in these countries, I think you have to start at the roots, which are, the families, the local associations, the schools, and the random selection principle, you can use it there to select class representatives, to select council members, and slowly, council by council, socialize a population to equality, which is what you get with random selection. And in particular, I'm thinking of women. As long as women are not empowered in the house, in the villages, in a way that allows a true dialogue and across ages, across genders, across religions. I mean, if you had the sort of ethnic tensions as well and religious tensions, then when political change comes, nothing changes because these old habits of unequal treatment and domination kick in again, and you get another strong man who had the best intentions, but somehow is only surrounding himself with the same members of the same tribes. And so I think that there's almost no point in going for the big picture revolution and the big change at the top if you don't already prepare the foundations. And I think that, in the US, the jury is such a foundation. The town hall meetings were such a foundation. In Switzerland, definitely, the reason why it's been, a very successful democracy that has bridged cultures and languages when the rest of Europe was, covered in blood with religious wars, is because at the town level, they were constantly talking across groups. And so I think that's like the only recommendation I can decently make. This is an incredibly complicated question.
Mm-hmm. Right. And in other forums, so Nick Gill says, in the UK, maybe this is what we should do with the House of Lords, turn it into a citizens' house of review, of randomly selected citizens. So take an institution everyone agrees needs some kind of reform and use that. Is there such an institution in Malaysia, Nazir, that would be a natural home for the Citizens' Assembly?
No, not at this point. I mean, we have a Senate. I suppose the Senate is a rubber stamp Senate more or less now, so maybe they could be converted into an assembly as well. But I think it's probably easier not to touch the existing institutions and just create a new one, and so that you're not seen to be hostile to anyone else. But on the earlier question, Ngari, I just want to say that the Malaysian experience shows that digital democracy is a means of getting out of a crisis. Where in 1970 we had complete breakdown and a dictatorship, and to get out of it we resorted to a deliberative platform. And similarly now, I think what our idea now is that we should create deliberative platforms so that we engage, we collaborate, we come up with solutions at a time when we worry that at this trajectory we might have a crisis again.
So if it can be the route out of a crisis, does that mean it could be a solution to in Afghanistan or in Burkina Faso or in countries which are currently in crisis, where there is both a government and a people that desperately need something to work? Would you say that that's a road forward?
Yeah, I certainly would. And I think even you look at kind of the Communist Party in China, they have essentially deliberative platforms as a means of engaging the citizens at large, right?
Right. Next question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Fadli from Malaysia. I'm studying MPP right now in BSG. I just want to ask Tan Sri Nazir. First, Better Malaysia Assembly is a noble idea that we need, but how will Better Malaysia Assembly establish its legitimacy in its efforts? And does the endorsement from the monarchy is enough to establish that legitimacy? And what would be the immediate milestones next for BMA in terms of carrying these efforts.
Thank you. Ari, I'm glad there's another Malaysian at BSG this year. So thanks, Fadli. And the short answer is that we have written to the monarchy, and all we're asking for is endorsement and recommendation. We believe that the BMA can only be set up by the executive and parliament. And we think that we want a real national effort where all the institutions come together and believe that this is the way forward. So parliament, government continue to do what you are meant to be doing. In the meanwhile, for the next 2 years, let this group of citizens deliberate a better way forward for the nation. And I think, with the support of parliament, monarchy, and government, you would naturally have the legitimacy.
Hélène, is there any other way to get legitimacy for such a forum? Roy Dark asked, it's just comments that deliberative assemblies will require redefining legitimacy.
Yes.
Nazir's idea is to get all the existing institutions to support it, but what other sources of legitimacy?
Well, I think we have to also consider that you can create legitimacy by delivering, by showing that you're successful at what you're doing. So that's what happened to the French Citizens Convention for Climate. Its legitimacy initially was quite tenuous. It was the product of the will of the prince. Macron, said there will be a convention, and there was a convention. And initially, suspicion and distrust and skepticism was like the reaction in France. And in fact, ignorance, because most people didn't know about it. But then, because the citizens who came appropriated the object, felt empowered, decided to evangelize for this convention. They went back to their regions of origin, organized meetings, they started tweeting, they started going on Instagram, all the social media, made the governance structure of this assembly very nervous, actually, because they initially wanted to keep it a little under control, but it gained a life of its own. And its legitimacy, I think, by the end was real and quite independent from the fact that it had been created by the president. So I think that's how when you start something, you're not sure it's going to work, but you have to take a chance, right, on this kind of new political actors. And I also wanted to mention, because this is really a question that I find very difficult about fragile states and places where democracy is non-existent or really very fragile. I'm thinking also of the experiment in Rojava, in Syria, where the Kurds have created this form of direct democracy. It's not based on random selection at all, but it really brings together women and people from all religion and ethnicities together in a very successful way, given the extremely dire circumstances, the threat of war and violence that they're under. And I don't know is as of today, they've been completely repressed or not, but for a while they showed a way, even in places that are, very difficult. And I want to say more generally, it's not just about randomly selected, assemblies. I think in Taiwan, there's also a great way that you can organize participation and deliberation in a community online through innovative digital technologies. So Audrey Tang is the Minister of Digital Technologies there. She's done amazing things. So it's kind of the opposite extreme of the Rojava experiment, if you want, because it's teched up and really like online, and it's for an educated population in a state that functions. But we have to be creative. We have to be open-minded, and I think we have to trust that new forms of democracy are going to be born not because they're dictated by a political theorist or imposed by a well-meaning politician, or there's a life also of associations and movements that will make those things emerge. I trust the process, if you will.
I mean, I think of legitimacy quite crudely as either input legitimacy. The government is legitimate because people have voted for them, and they make laws within the rules of the system, but they're legitimate because we voted for them, versus the legitimacy of our judicial system, which rests on the reasoning that judges give for their decisions. where does a deliberative assembly fit? Do they have to give reasons for their decisions? Is that why people accept their legitimacy? Or is it because they are representative of the people? Or does the randomness of their selection give them, like, tell me where it fits within that.
So I tend to view legitimacy as a mix of all these factors, right? It's both who's part of the process, what the process is like, and what the outputs are likely to be. I think all three things usually, increase the legitimacy of an institution or an authority. And in the case of deliberative assemblies that are based on random selection, it's definitely the throughput legitimacy that matters, meaning that they are deliberative. It's not a place where people just grandstand and posture and try to score points. It's truly a place where they think through difficult issues and they come up with reasons, and they're capable of giving an account of why they're going for such and such solutions. So that's definitely a huge part. The output legitimacy is still very weak because they haven't done that much, right? Again, because they haven't been properly empowered, they haven't been properly institutionalized. But it's starting. In Belgium, East Belgium, they've empowered a small council of 27 randomly selected citizens to set the agenda. So as we do more of this, the output legitimacy, I think, will grow. And the input legitimacy, I guess, it's not that the public actually voted for them, obviously, but if there is consent and consensus around the idea of random selection, you could have, I guess, input legitimacy that way. And there's this additional legitimacy that I don't know what to call, but it's just the fact that we all get an equal chance of being part of these bodies. Its democraticity is actually another source of legitimacy.
And Nazir, in Malaysia, are there local traditional forms of decision-making that this could build from, other than the, the National Deliberative Council that you cite? Are there any other forms of decision-making that take place in local communities?
I think there have been in villages. They've had various setups, a bit like in India as well, where villages actually come together in a very Greek way to deliberate. But those are, I guess, small in settings.
Thank you. Let me take one last question from the audience here. Yes, do introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Keisuke, and I'm a visiting student. But I wanted to ask, especially in the US, I guess, there's this huge environment of misinformation where people don't even seem to be able to agree on simple problems like climate change exists. So I guess I'm just wondering whether there's optimism. I mean, why do you have so much optimism in this random selection when so many swaths of people can't even agree? Because it just seems like that ship maybe has sailed in certain countries.
So is it too late? Well, I don't think you can think that it's too late. We have to do something. That's one thing. But the other is that I think the sort of polarizing environment is a result of a badly designed democracy rather than the cause, or at least it's equally both. And so if we change the system and if we make the system more truly democratic, I think the media ecology will change. It might require, though, something even more radical than what we've been talking about so far. And the question of from here to there is even more difficult, which is democratizing firms, corporations, the media, meaning changing the selection method for staffing boards of directors. Because if you do that, the implications are enormous. You empower workers, you empower Facebook workers, the engineers at Google, the consumers potentially. You could have representatives of those stakeholders as well. At that point, I think you would have an ecology of media that would be very different. That wouldn't be necessarily trying to maximize clicks and trying to mine our data and trying to. This would be a different world. It's hard to model because there are too many unknown, but I think we're at a point where the crisis is so deep and has been running for so long that if we're not bold, nothing will change.
And the experiments of Fishkin and others in America have shown that once you get people in the same room together deliberating, the extremes actually mitigate. People start changing their view of why the other has the same, has such a different view, etc. So some evidence. Tansri, Nazir, Razak, let me turn to you for a final word.
Yeah, thank you, Gary and Hélène, and thank you for this marvelous session. I mean, I think, you know, I'm deep into this project and fairly and determined that we see the light of day. I'm very confident that one day Malaysia will have this Better Malaysia Assembly. I just hope it will be sooner rather than too late, because, you know, I think this is really the right way for us to bring our problems onto the table and discuss and come up with solutions, which I don't think politicians can arrive at. I think in terms of Hélène and I, where we have maybe not full convergence is in terms of participation in the assembly itself. You know, I'm more focused on the deliberation and the recommendations that come out in the assembly rather than you know, the purity of the participation in the assembly. I would certainly go for a hybrid of some sort. As I say publicly here, I think what we need to see in the assembly is the good, the great, and the ordinary coming together and arriving at good solutions for a better Malaysia.
Hélène, a last word. How far can you go on that without it looking like just PR? We've invited you along, you know, as the ordinary, to put a stamp of legitimacy on our decisions. What did you call it? Deliberation washing?
Participation washing. Well, so, you know, you have to pre-commit. If politicians want to do that, they have to pre-commit and then keep their promises. So, you know, famously, President Macron said at the beginning, I will take your proposals and submit them without filtering to, you know, referendum or parliament. And at the end, there was a lot of filtering going on, and that created a lot of anger and pushback and disillusionment. So I think that you have to think really hard about what you're willing to do and risk, and then stick to it and trust the process. This is very hard for politicians because they want to be in control and know exactly what they're going to get. That's why, you know, referenda often, they're just a show. They already know what the outcome is going to be. And when the outcome is not what they expect, like Brexit, everybody's, you know, losing it. But I think you have to trust the process. If you're truly a committed Democrat, you have to believe that citizens are capable of making the right decision, even if you think if it's against your judgment.
And when you look at the 600 experimentations as a scholar, does that give you confidence that that starting presumption is right? That put citizens into a well-designed deliberative forum and they will come up with a sensible outcome?
Yes, it does. It's not the only thing that gives me hope, actually. I think, you know, historical evidence, theory, and recent practice all converge toward this fundamental democratic intuition that we're all equal and all capable of contributing to the definition of the common good. And it always strikes me how hard it is for people to come to that conclusion when in fact it's supposed to be a premise of the system we're in, right? It's hard to trust each other, bizarrely. It's hard to trust ourselves. But that's what we're supposed to do if we're true Democrats.
Well, thank you. Professor Hélène Landemore, professor of political theory, whose doctorate was about David Hume and who has been, you know, bringing her thinking right through to the cutting edge of the 21st century ever since. And to Tansri Nazir Razak, who's been wrestling with and tackling how to strengthen Malaysia, spent a year really thinking about it comparatively here at Oxford University and is now practically implementing different kinds of solutions. Can you all join me in thanking two fantastic panelists for a great discussion today? Thank you all. Thank you all.